The galaxy had never been kind to humanity. In the 4,000 years since they had first stepped beyond their small blue world, humans had clawed their way into the stars, only to discover that the universe was already crowded. Over 4,000 species called the galaxy home, bound together under the rule of the concord of aligned species. And among all of them, humanity sat near the bottom of the table. A young species, a loud species, a species that other civilizations smiled at, the way an adult smiles at a child who has just learned to tie its shoes. Dr. Essen Morrow had spent her entire career being smiled at like that. She sat alone in her cramped office on Predate Station, a research outpost floating at the edge of Concord space. Stacks of old data tablets covered every surface. Star charts papered the walls, connected by colored strings and handwritten notes that made the room look like the workspace of a madwoman. To most of her colleagues, that was exactly what she was. Essen was a xenoarchaeologist. She studied dead civilizations and ancient ruins. But while every other archaeologist in the Concord dug through sites a few 100,000 years old, Essen was obsessed with something much older. She believed that long before the Thalvori, the oldest known species who had walked the stars for over 2 million years, something else had existed. Something ancient beyond measure, and no one wanted to hear it. The Thalvori were proud creatures, tall, silver-skinned, with 4 eyes that seemed to look through you instead of at you. They had built the foundations of galactic civilization, and they never let anyone forget it. Their title, the First People, was written into the founding laws of the Concord. To suggest that someone had come before them was not just unpopular, it was almost offensive. Essen did not care about being offensive. She cared about the truth. The signal had arrived 3 days ago. A deep space observatory on the far side of the Orion Arm had picked up an energy pulse coming from Keth Voren, a dying red supergiant nearly 40,000 light-years from Earth. The observatory team had logged it as stellar noise and moved on. But Essen had been running a custom filter on observatory feeds for years, searching for exactly this kind of anomaly. When the data hit her screen, she almost knocked her coffee off the desk, reaching for it. The pulse was not random. Buried inside the radiation, hidden beneath layers of stellar static, there was a pattern, a structured, repeating mathematical sequence. It was faint, it was ancient, and it was not natural. She had taken her findings to the Concord Bureau of Antiquities that same day. Counselor Drethvahan, the Thalvori elder who ran the bureau, had listened to her presentation with the patience of a stone. When she finished, he had folded his long fingers together and told her, in his calm and careful voice, that her theory was fanciful, and that the Bureau would not waste resources chasing ghosts inside a dying star. Essen had expected nothing less. She had planned for it. That evening, she sent a private message to a man she had not spoken to in 2 years. His name was Cale Oren, and he was exactly the kind of person the Concord preferred to pretend did not exist. Cale was a salvage captain. He flew a battered, retrofitted survey vessel called the Outrider into the parts of space where polite society did not go, and he pulled things out of the dark that others were too careful to touch. He was rough, stubborn, and completely unimpressed by authority. He was also the best pilot Essen had ever met. Cale read her message, looked at the data she had attached, and sent back a single line. "When do we leave?" They departed from Predate Station 2 days later, quietly, without filing a flight plan. The Outrider slipped into deep space like a stone sinking into dark water. The crew was small. Cale at the helm, Essen in the research bay, and Risal, a Velith data analyst who had served aboard the Outrider for 3 years. Risal was insectoid. She stood on 4 legs and had 2 delicate arms that moved with the precision of a surgeon. Her compound eyes saw in spectrums that humans could not even name. She spoke softly and thought deeply, and she had a quiet fascination with humans that she rarely talked about. To her, they were a strange species, so short-lived, so fragile, and yet they pushed forward with a stubbornness that bordered on madness. She admired them, and she did not fully understand why. The journey to Kethvoron took 11 days at maximum drift speed. During that time, Risal ran deep analysis on the signal data. She stripped away layer after layer of interference, cleaning the signal like a restorer cleaning centuries of grime from a painting. And on the 9th day, she called Essen and Kale to her station with a voice that was unusually tense. The signal's underlying encoding used base 10 mathematics. It was a small detail, a technicality, but it hit the room like a thunderclap. Base 10 mathematics was not universal. Different species used different numerical systems depending on the biology of their limbs and their cognitive evolution. The Thalvori used base 8. The Velith used base 12. But humans, with their 10 fingers, had built their entire mathematical history on base 10. The signal, coming from a star that was over 11 billion years old, was speaking in a language that only made sense if it had been created by beings who counted to 10 on their hands. Kale leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. Risal's mandibles clicked softly, a sign of deep unease. Essen stood perfectly still, her face pale, her eyes locked on the data scrolling across the screen. "That star," she said quietly, "is 11 billion years old." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Our species is 200,000 years old. The entire Earth is only 4.5 billion years old." She looked at Kale. She looked at Risal. "How is this possible?" No one answered. The Outrider flew on through the dark, carrying 3 people and a question that could break the galaxy wide open. Behind them, the stars of known civilization grew smaller. Ahead of them, the dying light of Kethvorun waited, red and ancient, holding a secret that had been patient for longer than worlds had existed. And in her office back on Verat Station, the data Essen had accessed before leaving sat in the Bureau's system, flagged and filed. It took less than a day for Counselor Vahan to notice that she had gone. It took him less than an hour after that to access her travel communications and realize where she was heading. He sat in his chamber for a long time, his 4 silver eyes staring at the wall, his expression unreadable. Then he opened a secure channel to the Thalvori Military Command and gave a single, quiet order. "Find her, stop her, and bring me everything she has found." Kethvoron filled the entire viewport like a wound in the sky. The star was dying, and it was dying loudly. Its surface churned with rivers of fire that stretched millions of kilometers into space. Great arcs of plasma erupted and fell back into the burning mass like the arms of a drowning giant. The light was red and angry, and it painted everything aboard the Outrider in shades of blood. Kale sat at the controls with both hands tight on the stick. His jaw was set. His eyes moved constantly, reading the instruments, watching the plasma currents, calculating paths through the chaos. He had flown through asteroid fields and past collapsing stations and into places where sane pilots refused to go. But he had never flown into a star before. No one had. There was no manual for this. "Shields at 62%, Risal reported from her station. Her voice was steady, but her 4 legs were braced hard against the deck. "Radiation is climbing fast. We have perhaps 90 minutes before the shields begin to fail." "Then we better not be slow about it," Kale said, and pushed the Outrider deeper into the fire. Essen stood behind him, gripping the back of his seat, watching the hell outside with wide eyes. She had dreamed about this moment for 20 years. She had imagined it 1,000 times. But imagination had not prepared her for the sheer scale of it. The star was so vast that the human mind simply could not hold it. It was like standing at the edge of an ocean that was also on fire and also trying to kill you. The deep scan had found the structure buried in the star's outer layer, its chromosphere. It should not have been there. Nothing built by any known species can survive inside a star, and yet the scan was clear. A lattice of unknown material, enormous, roughly the size of a small moon, sitting in the fire as calmly as a stone at the bottom of a river. Kale threaded the outrider through a gap between two massive plasma eruptions. The ship shook hard. Warning lights blinked. Something in the lower deck made a sound that metal should not make. But Kale's hands were steady, and the ship held together. And then suddenly, the lattice was there, right in front of them, and every person on the bridge stopped breathing. It was beautiful. There was no other word for it. The structure was a web of dark material that seemed to drink the light around it. It pulsed with a faint blue glow that stood out against the red fury of the star, like a cool flame in a furnace. It was geometric and precise, built with a level of engineering that made the greatest achievements of the Concorde look like sandcastles. The readings on Risol's screen said it was impossibly, incomprehensibly old. They docked the outrider against one of the lattice arms. The structure's surface was smooth and warm to the touch, but not hot, despite being inside a star. Essen and Risol suited up and stepped outside. The star raged around them, beyond the lattice's protective field. But within its boundaries, the space was calm and quiet, as if the structure existed in its own private bubble of peace. They found the entrance almost immediately. It was a doorway, tall and arched, cut into the surface of the lattice with perfect precision. There were no symbols on it, no markings, no handles or buttons. But as Essen approached, something inside the door recognized her presence. The material shifted and folded inward like a flower opening, and a passage of soft blue light appeared before them. Risol's mandibles clicked rapidly. "It responded to you," she said. "To you." Essen stared into the passage. Her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her teeth. She stepped inside. The chamber beyond was vast. The ceiling disappeared into darkness far above. The walls were lined with alcoves, and in each alcove sat objects, tools, containers, sculptures, devices whose purpose Essen could not guess. Everything was covered in a fine layer of dust that sparkled faintly in the blue light. The air was still and ancient. It felt like stepping into a cathedral that had been sealed since before the earth existed. Risol ran her scanner over the nearest objects. The radiometric dating results came back, and she read them 3 times to make sure. Then she read them a 4th time. "Over 10 billion years," she said. Her voice was barely a whisper. "These artifacts are over 10 billion years old." Essen picked up one of the tools. It was a hand tool shaped for gripping. It fit her hand perfectly. 5 finger grooves. A palm rest shaped for a human grip. She set it down and moved to the sculptures. They stood in a row along the far wall, figures carved from a dark stone-like material. They were upright, 2 legs, 2 arms, forward-facing eyes, broad shoulders. The proportions were not exactly human, but they were close. So close that looking at them felt like looking into a strange mirror. "Essen," Risol said from across the chamber. "Come here." At the center of the room sat a pedestal, and on the pedestal was a crystalline core the size of a human head. It was dark and still. Essen reached out and touched it, and the moment her fingers made contact, the core blazed to life with white light. A holographic image erupted from its surface and filled the chamber. It was a figure, a person, standing tall, dressed in something that flowed like liquid silver. The face was calm and wise and sad, and it was unmistakably, undeniably close to human. Not identical. The eyes were slightly larger. The bone structure was sharper. But the resemblance was so strong that Essen felt the ground tilt beneath her feet. The figure spoke. The words rolled through the chamber in a language that the Outrider's AI could not translate. But Rizal, who had been studying human linguistic history as a personal hobby for years, went very still. "The phonetic structures," she said slowly, "they bear similarities to what human scholars call Proto-Indo-European roots. This language is related to yours, Essen. It is related to human speech." The hologram spoke for 90 seconds, then faded. The chamber was silent again. Essen stood in the middle of a room that was older than most stars, surrounded by artifacts shaped for human hands, staring at the space where a nearly human face had spoken in a nearly human tongue, and she felt the entire history of her species rearrange itself inside her mind. They returned to the Outrider in silence. Kale was waiting at the airlock. He took one look at their faces and did not ask questions. He just led them to the bridge and sat them down. Rizal uploaded the data. Kale looked at the readings. He looked at the images. He looked at the tool that fit a human hand and the sculptures that wore human shapes. He was not a scientist. He was not a philosopher. He was a man who hauled cargo through dangerous space and fixed broken engines with tape and stubbornness. But even he understood what he was looking at. "So what do we do?" he asked. Essen took a long breath. "We tell everyone." He sat down at the communications console and composed a narrow-beam encrypted transmission aimed at human space. The message was short. It contained the location, the dating results, and a single line of text. "You need to see this." He sent it. The message raced out into the dark at the speed of light, carrying the heaviest truth the galaxy had ever known. And neither Kale, nor Essen, nor Rizal knew that 6,000 light-years away, a Thalvori surveillance relay had already caught the signal, decoded it, and forwarded it to Counselor Dreth Vahan. The old Thalvori read the message in his private chamber. His 4 silver eyes moved across the words once, twice, 3 times. His composed face, the face that had not shown surprise in over 200 years, changed. Just slightly. Just enough. He classified the information immediately. Then he opened a channel to the Thalvori's Second Fleet and gave the order to move. 12 warships turned toward Keth-Varun, engines burning hot, racing to reach the dying star before the truth could escape it. The news broke like a dam. Essen had sent her findings not just to human space, but to 3 independent scientific networks she trusted. She knew that if the data stayed in one place, it could be buried, so she scattered it. Within 48 hours, fragments of the discovery were moving through academic channels across the galaxy. Within 72 hours, it hit the public networks, and within a week, the concord of aligned species was on fire. Essen did not care about the politics. She had work to do. Deep inside the Keth-Vorun archive, surrounded by 10-billion-year-old silence, she sat cross-legged on the ancient floor with data cores arranged around her like the pieces of a puzzle. Each core responded to her touch and only her touch. Rizal had tested this. When the Velith placed her clawed hand on the crystals, nothing happened. When Essen touched them, they lit up like small suns. Whatever the archive's builders had designed, they had designed it to recognize something in human biology, something written in the blood and bone of her species. The cores contained information so dense that the Outrider's computers could only translate small pieces at a time. But piece by piece, a picture was forming, and the picture was beyond anything Essen had imagined, even in her wildest theories. The builders called themselves the Aethen. They had existed over 10 billion years ago, in the earliest era of the galaxy's formation, when most stars were young and the universe was still cooling from its violent birth. They were not merely a civilization. They were something closer to gardeners, star shapers. They had possessed the ability to engineer the evolution of stars themselves, triggering supernovae at precise moments to scatter heavy elements across space, sculpting nebulae into nurseries where new solar systems would one day form. Essen sat back and stared at the holographic star maps floating above the cores. She could see it, the patterns, the fingerprints. The Aethan had not just lived in the galaxy. They had built it. Every carbon atom in every living being, every iron core at the heart of every rocky world, every drop of water on every ocean planet owed its existence to the Aethan's careful, patient work across billions of years. The Thalvori had not been the first civilization. They had not even been close. They were flowers that had grown in a garden someone else had planted. And the gardeners had looked like humans. Risal helped Essen catalog the findings, her compound eyes reflecting the blue glow of the archive. She worked in silence for a long time before she finally spoke. "The Concord will not accept this easily," she said. "The Thalvori built their entire identity on being the eldest. You are not just challenging a theory, Essen. You are challenging who they believe they are." Essen nodded. She understood. But the truth did not care about comfort. 6,000 light-years away, the truth was already causing pain. The Galactic Forum on Thesara Prime had erupted into chaos. Representatives from hundreds of species shouted over each other in the great circular chamber. Holographic displays showed the data from Keth Faroon on every screen. The Thalvori delegation sat in rigid silence, their silver faces betraying nothing, while species that had spent centuries deferring to them now looked at them with new and uncertain eyes. Counselor Drethvahan watched the chaos from his elevated seat at the head of the chamber. He had spent 260 years building his reputation as a voice of reason and authority. He had guided the Concord through wars, plagues, and political crises. He had done it all, standing on the foundation of one unquestioned truth, that the Thalvori were the first, the eldest, the foundation upon which galactic civilization rested. And now that foundation was cracking beneath his feet. He could feel it. The doubt, the whispers, the way other delegates looked at him and then looked away. The Thalvori identity was not just pride. It was structure. It was the reason they led the Bureau of Antiquities, held permanent seats on every major council, and spoke first at every assembly. If they were not the first, then what were they? Just another species, just another voice in the crowd. Vahan could not allow that. Not yet. Not without control. He sent the order to the Second Fleet. Secure the archive. Bring the artifacts under Thalvori jurisdiction for proper study. The word proper was doing a lot of work in that sentence, and everyone who heard it understood what it really meant. The fleet arrived at Keth Faroon on a Tuesday. Kale saw them coming on long-range sensors. 12 warships, sleek and silver, dropping out of faster-than-light travel in perfect formation. They surrounded the dying star like wolves, circling a campfire. A hail came through almost immediately. A Thalvori commander, crisp and formal, informed the Outrider that it was to surrender all recovered artifacts and data, submit to inspection, and prepare to be escorted back to Concord space. Hale leaned back in his chair and looked at the transmission with the expression of a man who had been told to hand over his ship by people who had never once offered to buy him a drink. He opened the reply channel. "No," he said. Then he closed the channel. The Thalvori commander was not used to hearing that word. The fleet tightened its formation. Weapon systems powered up. The Outrider was a salvage vessel with light shields and no guns. Against 12 warships, it would last roughly as long as a candle in a hurricane. But Kale had not survived 20 years in deep space by being stupid. The moment he had sent the original transmission to human space, he had included a coded distress tag that routed through military channels. Somewhere out there, someone was listening. He just had to hold on long enough for them to arrive. That someone was Admiral Syra Voss. Voss was not the kind of officer who appeared in recruitment posters. She was lean, and hard-faced, with short gray hair and eyes that could cut through steel plate. She had commanded the UEN Prometheus, a human dreadnought, for 11 years, and she had spent most of those years stationed at the galactic frontier, watching the dark and keeping the peace. She was practical, she was smart, and she did not bluff. When Kale's distress tag reached her, she read the attached data in her quarters, alone. She read it twice. Then she stood up, walked to the bridge, and ordered the Prometheus and its escort group to make best speed for Keth Varun. No explanation, no hesitation. Her crew did not question her. They had learned long ago that when Voss moved fast, there was a reason. The human battle group arrived 4 hours after the Thalvori fleet. They dropped out of faster-than-light travel in a loose combat spread, the Prometheus at the center like an iron fist. Voss opened a channel to the Thalvori commander, and then, over that commander's head, directly to Counselor Vahan on Thessara Prime. "Counselor," she said. Her voice was calm and carried the weight of someone who had already made every decision she needed to make. "My government has been informed of the discovery at Keth Vorun. These artifacts are of human origin and fall under human heritage jurisdiction. We will not be surrendering them." Vahan's face appeared on the screen. His 4 eyes studied her. "Admiral," he said carefully, "you are making a serious mistake. These artifacts must be studied properly, under Concord authority. With respect, Counselor, you denied the expedition that found them. You classified the data, and you sent a military fleet before you sent a single scientist. That does not look like a desire for proper study. That looks like a desire for control." The channel was silent for a long moment. The two fleets hung in space around the dying star, weapons aimed, shields raised, waiting. Deep inside the archive, Essen felt the vibrations of the standoff through the walls. She had found the deepest data core, larger than the others, pulsing with a slow, steady rhythm, like a heartbeat. She placed both hands on its surface. The entire structure woke up. Light cascaded through the lattice in waves. The walls hummed with a resonance that Essen felt in her bones. The archive, dormant for 10 billion years, recognized her and responded. And from the deepest core, a final holographic figure rose into the air. The last Aethan, taller than the others, older, wearing an expression of such profound love and sadness that Essen's eyes filled with tears before a single word was spoken. The ship's AI, overwhelmed by the new data flooding from the awakened archive, finally cracked the language. The figure spoke, and the translation scrolled across Essen's visor in simple, clear words. "To our children, who will find this when they are ready, we left everything for you, not because you are weak, but because you are strong enough to begin again. Remember what you are." The message ended. The figure faded, and Essen Morrow stood alone in the blue light, crying quietly, holding the weight of 10 billion years in her shaking hands. The archive's signal could not be stopped. When the structure awakened, it did not whisper. It screamed. A pulse of energy erupted from the lattice inside Keth Vorin and raced outward at faster-than-light speed, punching through every communication relay, every sensor network, every receiver in the galaxy. The Aethan's final message played on the bridges of warships, in the halls of governments, in the homes of ordinary people on 10,000 worlds. Every species heard it. Every species saw the face of the last Aethan, that almost human face, ancient and kind, and heard the translated words. "Remember what you are." The galaxy did not take it well. On Thessara Prime, the Concord Forum descended into something close to panic. The Thalvori delegation walked out. 3 elder species called for emergency military sessions. A coalition of younger species, many of whom had spent centuries being told to know their place, began openly questioning the authority structures that had governed the galaxy for millennia. If the Thalvori were not the first, then why did they lead? If humanity's ancestors had built the conditions for all life, and what did that mean for the power that elder species held? The questions were dangerous, not because they were wrong, but because they had no easy answers. Inside the archive, Ezen worked without rest. The awakened cores were pouring out data faster than she could process it, and every new piece of information made the picture larger and stranger and more overwhelming. Rizal worked beside her, translating, cataloging, organizing. The Velith had not slept in 2 days. Her compound eyes were dull with exhaustion, but she refused to stop. She understood, perhaps better than anyone except Essen, that what they were uncovering would reshape everything. The Aethan had not died. That was the revelation that broke Essen's heart and put it back together in a new shape. The data cores told the story in fragments, like pages torn from a book and scattered across time. But Essen was patient, and slowly the full picture emerged. The Aethan had reached a level of power that was difficult to even describe. They could move stars. They could shape the birth of solar systems. They could engineer the fundamental chemistry of life across galactic distances. They had been, by any reasonable definition, gods. And they had chosen to stop. The records showed a great deliberation, a decision made not in haste, but over thousands of years. The Aethan understood that their presence was a ceiling. As long as they existed, no new life could rise on its own terms. Every species that evolved would do so in their shadow, shaped by their will, dependent on their guidance. The Aethan did not want children who obeyed. They wanted descendants who grew. So they dissolved. They dismantled their civilization piece by piece. They shut down their great machines. They sealed their knowledge in archives like this one, hidden inside dying stars where they would only be found when someone was ready to look. And then they did something extraordinary. They stripped themselves of their power, their memories, their identity. They scattered their genetic material into the galaxy like seeds thrown into the wind. And on a small, unremarkable rocky world, orbiting a quiet yellow star, some of those seeds took root. Humanity had not risen from nothing. Humanity had risen from everything. They were the Aethan, reduced to bare biology, starting over from the very beginning. Every struggle in human history, every war, every famine, every painful step from caves to fire to language to stars, had been part of a journey that the Aethan had designed. Not because they wanted their descendants to suffer, but because they believed that the only power worth having was power that was earned through suffering and survival and choice. Essen sat on the floor of the archive and cried for the second time. Not from sadness, from the sheer weight of it. Every human who had ever lived, every mother who had fought to feed her children, every scientist who had stared at the stars and wondered, every soldier who had died defending something they believed in, they had all been part of a story so much bigger than any of them had ever known. And they had passed the test. They had made it back to the stars. They had found the archive. They were ready. She wiped her eyes and got back to work. There was more in the cores. Much more. Outside, the standoff between the human battle group and the Thalvori fleet had grown tense. But it was not the only crisis unfolding. Across the galaxy, a coalition of elder species had formed in the hours after the broadcast. They called themselves the Preservation Alliance, and their goal was simple: destroy the archive before its contents could spread further. They saw the Aethan's legacy not as a gift, but as a threat. If humanity was connected to beings who had once shaped the galaxy itself, then humanity was dangerous. What if they remembered? What if the power came back? What if the youngest species in the Concord became the most powerful overnight? Fear is a powerful motivator. The Preservation Alliance assembled a combined fleet of over 40 warships from 6 species, and set course for Keth Vorin. Admiral Voss saw them coming on long-range sensors. She had 7 ships, 7 against 40. But Voss had not earned her rank by running from bad math. She repositioned her battle group between the approaching fleet and the dying star, placing the Prometheus directly in the path of the largest concentration of enemy vessels. Then she broadcast a message on an open channel that every ship in the system could hear. "This archive belongs to no single species," she said. "It belongs to history. If you fire on us, you fire on the truth. And I promise you, the truth will survive longer than any of us." The Preservation Alliance fleet did not slow down. Kale, who had been listening from the Outrider's bridge, stood up and walked to the small cargo bay at the back of his ship. He opened a locker that he had never shown to Essen or Riesal. Inside were parts, old parts, military parts. He had been a Navy engineer before he became a salvage captain. In 30 minutes, he had assembled a crude but functional weapons array from salvage components and mounted it on the Outrider's hull. Riesal watched him work. "That will not stop a warship," she said. "No," Kale agreed, "but it will annoy one, and sometimes that is enough." The battle began at 1400 hours, Galactic Standard Time. The Preservation Alliance fleet opened fire. Voss responded with precise, controlled volleys, targeting engines and weapon systems rather than hulls. She was not trying to destroy anyone. She was trying to buy time. Every minute the archive survived was another minute its signal spread deeper into the galaxy, reaching more worlds, more people, more minds that could carry the knowledge forward, even if the archive itself was destroyed. The Prometheus took heavy fire. Its shields buckled. 2 escort ships were disabled. But Voss held the line. She held it with skill and stubbornness, and the kind of cold, clear courage that does not shout or shake its fist, but simply refuses to move. And inside the archive, Essen found the last secret. The Keth Vorin archive was not just a record, it was a key. The Aethan had left caches across the entire galaxy, hidden in dying stars, buried in the cores of dead worlds, drifting in the spaces between galaxies. Thousands of them, each one containing knowledge, tools, and technology beyond anything the Concord had ever dreamed of. And this archive, this single structure inside this single dying star, was the master switch that unlocked them all. Essen placed her hand on the central core. The archive did not ask for a password. It did not demand a code. It scanned her body at a level deeper than DNA, reading something written in the fundamental structure of her cells, a signature that the Aethan had woven into their genetic legacy 10 billion years ago. Not in words on a screen, in a voice that resonated through the lattice, through the star, through the fabric of space itself. Activation confirmed. Welcome home, Aeson. And across the galaxy, on 1,000 dead and dying stars, ancient machines that had slept since before the first planet cooled began to wake up. Their lights came on, one by one, like candles being lit in a vast and endless dark. The inheritance was open. The children had come home. The galaxy waited for the weapons. Every species, every government, every military commander staring at their sensors watched the Aethan caches awaken across the stars and braced for the worst. This was how the story was supposed to go. An ancient power returns. Old machines come back to life, and then the fire comes, and the galaxy burns, and whoever holds the keys becomes the new master of everything. The weapons never came. The caches opened, and what poured out of them was not destruction. It was knowledge, pure, vast, and free. Stellar engineering techniques that could stabilize dying stars and extend the life of solar systems by billions of years. Medical science so advanced that diseases which had plagued the Concord for millennia suddenly had cures. Ecological restoration methods that could heal worlds poisoned by war or industry. Energy systems that drew power from the fabric of space itself, limitless and clean, enough to sustain every civilization in the galaxy for longer than any of them could imagine. The Aethan had not left behind an arsenal. They had left behind a garden shed. The data flowed freely. It did not route through human channels or human systems. It broadcast in every direction, in formats that every species could read, without encryption or restriction. The caches did not recognize borders or hierarchies. They simply opened and gave, the way a river gives water to every field it touches without asking who owns the land. On the bridge of the Prometheus, Admiral Voss watched the incoming data streams with an expression that slowly shifted from tension to something softer. Around her, the Preservation Alliance fleet had stopped firing. Their sensors were showing them the same thing hers were showing her. The knowledge spreading from the caches was already being received on their homeworlds. On one of their own planets, a plague that had killed millions over the past decade was being analyzed against Aethan medical data, and a cure was forming in real time on laboratory screens. It is difficult to keep shooting at someone when the thing you are trying to destroy is saving your children. One by one, the Alliance ships powered down their weapons. The fleet scattered, not in retreat, but in confusion, in shame, in the slow and painful realization that they had almost destroyed the greatest gift the galaxy had ever received. Voss did not gloat. She simply stood down her own weapons, ordered her damaged ships to begin repairs, and poured herself a cup of coffee. She had learned long ago that victory and relief look the same from the inside. On Thessara Prime, the Concord Forum reconvened. The chamber was full, but it was quiet now. The data from the caches was on every screen, undeniable and overwhelming. Representatives who had spent the previous week calling for the archive's destruction now sat in silence, reading the gift that had almost been lost because of their fear. Essen Morrow addressed the forum. Her image was broadcast from inside the Keth Voren archive, the blue light of the Aethan's legacy glowing behind her. She looked tired. She looked like a woman who had not slept properly in 2 weeks. But her voice was clear. She did not speak as a conqueror. She had no interest in conquest. She did not speak as a prophet or a messiah. She was a scientist, and she spoke like one, with care and precision and humility. The Aethan did not leave this gift for humanity, she said. They left it for everyone. Their stellar engineering created the heavy elements that make up every living body in this galaxy. The iron in Thalvori blood was forged in the same Aethan-triggered supernovae as the iron in mine. The carbon in Velet's shells came from the same seeded nebulae as the carbon in human bones. We are, all of us, in the most basic and literal sense, made from the same source. The Aethan did not have children. They had a galaxy full of grandchildren, and they loved all of us enough to let us grow up on our own. The forum was silent. 4,000 species, represented by thousands of delegates, sat with the weight of those words pressing down on them. It was not a comfortable silence. It was the silence of people whose understanding of themselves had just been rewritten. Counselor Dreth Vahan sat in his elevated seat and listened. His 4 silver eyes were closed. He had not spoken in 3 days. The Thalvori delegation around him was fractured, some furious, some lost, some quietly reading the Aethan data and beginning the slow process of accepting what it meant. Vahan had spent those 3 days in private, thinking. He had lived for over 300 years. He had built his life on the certainty that his people were the foundation of galactic civilization. And now that certainty was gone, and he had to decide what kind of person he was without it. He opened his eyes. He stood. The chamber fell even more silent, if that was possible. Every eye and sensor and optical organ turned to him. Vahan was tall, even for a Thalvori. He carried himself with the dignity of a species that had led the galaxy for 2 million years. He looked out at the assembly. He looked at the human delegates. He looked at the image of Essen Morrow still glowing on the central screen. And then he did something that no Thalvori leader had done in the entire recorded history of their civilization. He acknowledged that the Thalvori were not the first. He said it simply, without drama, without excuses. He said that truth was more important than pride, that the Concord could not be built on a foundation that was false, and that the Thalvori would work alongside every other species to understand and share the Athens legacy. It cost him everything. His political allies abandoned him before he finished speaking. His own delegation stared at him with expressions that mixed horror and respect in equal measure. But he said it, and he meant it, and when he sat down, the chamber remained silent for a full 30 seconds before the first hesitant sound of applause began. Risal, watching the broadcast from the Outriders' crew quarters, clicked her mandibles softly. "That," she said to no one in particular, "is what courage looks like." The weeks that followed were messy and complicated, and full of arguments, as all great changes are. But the Athen knowledge was already doing its work. On 3 worlds, plagues were cured. In 2 star systems, collapsing suns were stabilized using techniques that the Concord's best engineers could barely understand, but could follow like a recipe. Resource crises that had fueled wars for centuries suddenly had solutions. The galaxy did not become perfect overnight, but it became possible. And possibility, after so long, felt like a miracle. Kale Oren was offered medals. He was offered a commission in the human navy. He was offered interviews, book deals, and a speaking tour that would have made him wealthy for the rest of his life. He turned all of it down. He refueled the Outrider, paid his docking fees, picked up a cargo contract hauling machine parts to a mining colony on the rim, and flew back out into the black. Risal went with him. She had grown fond of the ship, and the ship had grown fond of her, and some partnerships do not need a reason to continue. Essen stayed at Kethvoron. She became the first curator of the archive, working alongside scholars from dozens of species to catalog and share the Athens knowledge. She spent the rest of her life in that blue light, surrounded by the echoes of ancestors she had never known, doing the quiet and steady work of making sure the gift was never hoarded and never lost. Years passed. The galaxy changed, not all at once, and not without struggle, but steadily, the way a river reshapes the land it flows through. One afternoon, a young Thalvori student visited the archive. She was barely 80 years old, young by Thalvori standards, with bright silver eyes full of curiosity. She walked through the ancient chambers with her mouth open, touching nothing, absorbing everything. She stopped in front of the central core, where the hologram of the last Athens still played on a loop, that ancient, almost human face speaking its final words into the endless future. She looked at the hologram for a long time. Then she turned to Essen, who was sitting nearby with a data tablet and a cup of cold tea. "Were they gods?" the student asked. Essen smiled. It was the smile of a woman who had been asked this question many times, and had thought about the answer even more. She set down her tea and looked at the hologram with an expression of deep and quiet love. "No," she said, "they were people. They were just people who refused to stop reaching." The student looked at the hologram again. She looked at the face that was so close to human and yet so impossibly old. And for the first time in her life, she did not see a rival species. She did not see a threat or a challenge to her people's pride. She saw family. Strange, ancient, wonderful family that she had never known she had. She smiled, and in the heart of a dying star, the light of the oldest human voice continued to burn, patient and steady and unafraid, waiting for the rest of the galaxy to catch up. It had waited for 10 billion years. It could wait a little longer. It had always known they would come.